He opened his door to starving wolves. What happened next will surprise you. The wind howled through the snow-covered trees, rattling against the sturdy wooden walls of Warren Pierce's cabin. Outside, the Alaskan wilderness lay buried, under a thick layer of ice and snow, an unforgiving landscape where only the strongest survived. Warren had spent years adapting to this isolated life, where the nearest town was miles away, and human contact was a rare occurrence. He preferred it that way. Solitude had become his closest companion. Tonight, however, something felt different. Seated by the fireplace, Warren absent-mindedly sipped his hot tea, staring at the flames as they flickered and danced. The bitter, cold outside made the warmth of the fire all the more comforting. He had stocked up enough firewood to last through the night, ensuring he wouldn't have to step out into the brutal chill until morning. Then he heard it, a faint scratching. At first, he thought it was just the wind playing tricks on him, the way it sometimes made the trees creak and groan like living things. But then it came again, a soft, desperate scraping against the door, followed by a low whimper. Frowning, Warren set down his mug and reached for the flashlight hanging by the door. He wasn't expecting visitors. Out here in the dead of winter, anything venturing this close to a human's dwelling was either lost, desperate, or dangerous. He knew better than to act carelessly. Peering through the frost-covered window, Warren's breath caught in his throat. There, just beyond the glow of his porchlight, stood two wolves. For a moment he didn't move, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. They weren't baring their teeth or growling. They weren't acting like predators at all. Instead, their bodies were hunched, trembling from the cold. Their fur, once thick and proud, was matted with ice, clinging to their thin frames. Even in the dim light, Warren could see their ribs pressing against their skin. They were starving, freezing, begging. He had seen wolves in the wild before, strong, untamed creatures that roamed in packs, their howls echoing through the mountains. But these two, they were different. Their eyes, glowing in the darkness, held something he had never seen in a wolf before: desperation. His instinct screamed at him to be cautious. Wolves were dangerous. Wild animals followed their instincts, and desperation could make any creature unpredictable. He knew he should ignore them, let nature take its course. But then one of them, a smaller wolf with a patch of grey fur along its back, let out a weak, almost pleading whine and scratched at the door again, as if it understood that inside lay warmth and safety. Warren clenched his jaw. His mind waged war against his heart. Letting them in was madness. If they turned on him, he wouldn't stand a chance. But leaving them out there, that wasn't something he could live with. With a slow, steadying breath, he reached for the rifle leaning against the wall, just in case. Then with a flick of his wrist, he unlatched the door and cracked it open. A gust of icy wind rushed in, making him shiver. The wolves flinched, but didn't retreat. The bigger one, a dark furred male, locked eyes with him, its body stiff, as if waiting for permission to move. For a long, tense moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Warren did something that went against every survival instinct he had. He stepped aside. The larger wolf hesitated, sniffing the air, but the smaller one took a slow, shaky step forward. It paused at the threshold, the heat from the cabin washing over its frost-covered body. Then, as if making a decision, it padded inside. The second wolf followed, keeping a watchful eye on Warren as it crossed into the warmth of the cabin. As soon as the door closed, the change was immediate. A visible shudder passed through the wolves, their tense bodies slowly relaxing as the warmth seeped into their frozen limbs. Warren stood frozen, gripping the rifle loosely, watching as the two creatures took in their surroundings. They sniffed cautiously at the wooden floor, the scent of firewood and cooked food lingering in the air. The smaller one lowered itself to the ground near the fireplace, curling up almost immediately, too exhausted to remain standing. The larger one, however, remained alert, its amber eyes never leaving Warren. He could feel the weight of the wolf's gaze as if it was trying to judge his intentions. With careful movements, Warren set the rifle down against the wall. He didn't know what would happen next, whether this was the right decision or the worst mistake of his life. All he knew was that for tonight, he wasn't alone. For a long moment, Warren stood at the door, his breath shallow, heart pounding. The cold wind howled through the trees, sending snow swirling around his boots. His fingers hovered over the door handle, hesitant, his mind screaming at him to think before acting. This was insane. The two wolves remained just beyond the threshold, their bodies trembling from the bitter cold. Their breath came in shallow, visible puffs, their fur crusted with ice. The smaller one, grey with patches of white, had already collapsed onto the porch, its ribs pressing against its skin. The larger wolf stood over it protectively, its amber eyes locked onto Warren, unblinking, waiting. They weren't attacking. They weren't even growling. They were just waiting. His instincts screamed danger. Wolves were predators, wild creatures. He had spent years in the Alaskan wilderness, understanding the delicate balance between man and nature. He had always respected the invisible boundary that separated them, and yet he tightened his grip on the rifle slung over his shoulder. Was this a test, a trick of nature? Another weak whimper snapped him out of his thoughts. His eyes drifted to the smaller wolf, curled in on itself, shivering violently. It wouldn't survive the night out here. Warren clenched his jaw. If he left them out there, they would die. If he let them in, he could be putting his own life in danger. His entire life had been built on calculated risks, knowing when to push forward and when to walk away. But this was something else. He wasn't risking money or supplies. He was risking his life. Another gust of wind hit him, cutting through his jacket. He had to decide. His fingers moved on their own, unhooking the latch. Click. The sound seemed to echo in the frozen air. The larger wolf stiffened, ears twitching at the noise. The smaller one barely reacted. Warren exhaled sharply, then slowly pulled the door open. Warmth spilled out from inside, a stark contrast to the brutal cold outside. The scent of burning wood and lingering food drifted through the air. The larger wolf hesitated. It sniffed the air, its body tense. Then, without warning, the smaller wolf dragged itself forward. It didn't wait for permission. It crawled across the porch, one slow, agonizing movement at a time, until its weakened limbs collapsed onto the wooden floor inside. It let out a soft, exhausted sigh, as if surrendering to whatever fate awaited it. The larger wolf was less certain. It stood frozen at the doorway, eyes flicking between Warren and its fallen companion. Warren could see the hesitation, the battle, between fear and trust raging within the animal. For a moment, he thought it might turn and run, but then it stepped forward. One cautious paw landed inside the cabin. Then another. Warren forced himself to breathe. Once both wolves were inside, he quietly, carefully pushed the door shut, sealing them all inside. The cabin immediately felt smaller. The sound of the wind was muffled now, replaced by the soft crackling of the fire and the wolves' labored breathing. The larger wolf stayed near the entrance, muscles coiled, ready to bolt or fight. Its ears flicked at every noise, every movement Warren made. The smaller wolf, however, barely moved. It curled near the fireplace, its entire body trembling violently from the cold. For the first time, Warren truly looked at them. They were thin, starved. Their fur, which should have been thick and proud, was tangled and patchy. The larger wolf's ribs were just barely visible beneath its dark coat, but the smaller one, it was worse. Warren's stomach twisted. How long had they been out there? How long had they suffered? He ran a hand down his face, trying to process what he had just done. Wild animals didn't seek out human shelter, not unless something was very, very wrong. So why had these wolves come to him? What had driven them here? And more importantly, what else was out there? The warmth of the cabin seeped into the frozen air, melting the icy tension that had settled between Warren and the wolves. He stood near the fireplace, his body stiff, his mind racing with uncertainty. What had he just done? Letting them inside had been a risk, a dangerous one. But now, as he watched them cautiously adjust to their new surroundings, another dilemma loomed before him. What next? The larger wolf remained near the door, its golden eyes locked onto Warren, unreadable, alert. Its muscles were tense, coiled as if ready to spring at the slightest provocation. Every flicker of movement made its ears twitch, its nostrils flaring. As it took in the unfamiliar sense of the cabin, wood, smoke, human. The smaller wolf had barely moved since collapsing by the fireplace. Its thin frame trembled violently, breath coming in shallow puffs. Its fur was damp, patches of ice clinging to its legs. Warren's gaze drifted lower. That's when he noticed the limp. One of its hind legs stretched awkwardly behind it, swollen and stiff. The way the wolf favored its other legs, refusing to put weight on the injured one, told Warren everything he needed to know. It was hurt, badly. His grip tightened around the plate in his hand. Food. That was the next step. Carefully, he crouched by his small pantry, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The wolves' eyes followed him, their gazes sharp and calculating. He pulled out a portion of raw meat, planned for his own dinner, and placed it onto an old metal plate. Then he hesitated. How should he do this? If he got too close, they might see it as a threat. If he simply tossed the food their way, would they lunge? Would they attack? The larger wolf let out a low exhale, its breath visible in the dim firelight. Warren wasn't sure if it was meant to be a warning or a sign of exhaustion. Slow, careful, no sudden moves. He placed the plate on the wooden floor a few feet away from them, then backed up, hands raised in a gesture of peace. For a moment, nothing happened. The wolves remained frozen, their eyes darting between him and the food, their instincts battling between caution and hunger. Then, the smaller one moved. It stretched its neck forward, nostrils flaring as it inhaled the scent of the raw meat. A low whimper escaped its throat, hesitation, uncertainty. Its body wavered, exhaustion pulling it back even as its hunger pushed it forward. The larger wolf stood first. It took a slow, testing step toward the plate, eyes never leaving Warren. One step, another. Its paws were eerily silent against the wooden floor. Warren held his breath. The wolf lowered its head and took a cautious bite. Then another. When no harm came, it devoured the meat within seconds. The smaller wolf remained still, watching, waiting. Then, with great effort, it lifted itself onto shaky legs. The moment it tried to put weight on its injured limb, it buckled. A sharp yelp cut through the air, raw and pained. The larger wolf immediately tensed, ears flattened, its gaze snapping to Warren, as if blaming him for its companion's suffering. Warren raised his hands again, showing he meant no harm. His eyes returned to the injured wolf. The way it shivered, the way its leg trembled beneath it. It wasn't just a minor wound. The swelling had worsened since it entered the warmth of the cabin. Frostbite, perhaps, or an old injury made worse by the relentless cold. Warren's jaw clenched. If he did nothing, it might not survive the night. He had first aid supplies, bandages, antiseptic, basic medical tools, but he wasn't a vet. And he wasn't sure if the wolves would let him get close enough to help. He glanced at the larger wolf, which had finished eating and now stood protectively over the injured one. Would it let him near? Would it understand that he was trying to help? The injured wolf let out another weak whine, curling its body tighter against the warmth of the fire. Warren sighed. He had already taken the risk of letting them in. Maybe it was time to take another. The cabin was eerily quiet, except for the occasional crackling of the fire. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling against the wooden walls, as if the storm itself disapproved of Warren's decision. Had he made a mistake? He leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his rifle still within reach. His eyes remained locked on the two wolves curled near the fireplace. The larger wolf, still alert, still watching him, had positioned itself between Warren and its injured companion. Even in its weakened state, it refused to lower its guard. The smaller wolf had stopped shivering as violently. The heat from the fire had started to work its way into its frozen limbs, but Warren could tell it was still in pain. Every now and then it would let out a soft whimper, shifting its weight as if trying to ease the throbbing in its injured leg. Warren exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. What the hell am I doing? He had spent years surviving in this remote wilderness, following the unspoken rule of nature: never interfere, Out here, the strong survived, and the weak didn't. But now, here he was, interfering. Two wild wolves, creatures that would normally keep their distance from a man like him, were now lying in his home, warming themselves by his fire. Why? That question gnawed at him as much as his own unease. Wolves didn't behave this way. They didn't seek shelter from humans, unless something was terribly, terribly wrong. His gaze drifted to the cabin door. Were they alone? A sudden chill crawled up his spine. He had been so focused on these two that he hadn't even considered the possibility that more might be out there. What if their pack was nearby? His stomach tightened at the thought. A full pack of wolves outside his cabin, waiting in the dark. That was a problem. He grabbed his flashlight and moved toward the window, careful not to make any sudden movements. The larger wolf lifted its head slightly, watching him, but it made no move to stop him. Warren pressed his forehead against the cold glass, scanning the darkness beyond the porch. The snow-covered landscape stretched into the night, untouched. Except for the tracks left behind by the wolves, no movement, no glowing eyes peering from the shadows, but that didn't mean they weren't out there. He clicked the flashlight on and slowly swept the beam across the tree line. The wind carried loose snow into the air, creating ghostly shapes that flickered in the dim light. But aside from the storm's restless movements, nothing stirred. Still, he didn't trust it. Turning back to the wolves, he studied them again. The smaller one had finally settled, its breathing slow, steady. The larger one, however, was still, awake, ears flicking toward every small creak of the cabin, every gust of wind. It was waiting, watching. Did it sense something he didn't? Warren sighed, rubbing his hands together to chase away the cold that had crept into his fingers. He needed sleep, but how could he sleep with two wolves in his home, one of them still wide awake, possibly waiting for a chance to turn on him? No, not turn on him. Escape. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. They weren't predators stalking him. They weren't planning an attack. They were scared. They didn't trust him. And why should they? They had spent their whole lives fearing humans, avoiding them. Something had forced them to break that rule tonight. Something had driven them here to his door in search of warmth and safety. What was it? Was it the cold? Hunger? Or was it something worse? He had many questions and not enough answers. Warren ran a hand through his hair and exhaled. He wasn't going to figure it out tonight. Right now, all he could do was keep the fire going and hope that come morning, things would start making sense. With one last look at the wolves, he grabbed an old blanket from the back of the couch and made his way to the armchair closest to the fire. The larger wolf's eyes tracked him as he moved, but it didn't growl, didn't flinch. Warren sat down, adjusting the blanket over himself, keeping his rifle resting within reach. He wouldn't sleep deeply tonight, but as the warmth of the fire wrapped around him, as exhaustion weighed down his limbs, he allowed himself to close his eyes, just for a little while. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, a man and two wolves waited for dawn. Morning came slow and cold. The fire in the cabin had died down to glowing embers, filling the space with a dim, flickering warmth. Warren stirred in his chair, his muscles aching from a night of uneasy sleep. He had kept one hand close to his rifle just in case, but no threats had come from inside the cabin. The wolves were still there. The smaller one lay curled tightly near the fireplace, its injured leg stretched out awkwardly, its body rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. The larger wolf remained near the door, head resting on its paws, but its amber eyes flicked open the moment Warren moved. It had been watching him. Warren sighed and ran a hand over his face. What now? He couldn't keep them here forever. He had made it through the night without a problem, but they were still wild animals, still unpredictable. He needed a plan. Stepping carefully over the wooden floorboards, he made his way to the window, pulling aside the thick curtain just enough to peer outside. Then he froze. There, just beyond the tree line, something moved. His heartbeat quickened as he focused on the shape, a figure half hidden in the morning mist, standing still, watching. Warren immediately reached for his rifle. Out here, visitors were rare, unexpected. Ones usually meant trouble. Keeping his movements slow, he made his way to the door, careful not to startle the wolves. The larger one had noticed the disturbance, its ears twitching, body tensed. It sensed something too. Warren inhaled deeply, bracing himself, then cracked the door open. The cold morning air rushed in, biting at his skin. The figure outside didn't move. Now, in the pale daylight, Warren could see it wasn't just anyone. It was a woman. She was bundled in a thick parka, a scarf wrapped tightly around her face, leaving only her sharp, watchful eyes visible. She wasn't lost. She was looking for something. Or someone. "You planning to stand out there all day?" Warren called, keeping his rifle lowered but ready. The woman hesitated for a second, then took a cautious step forward. "I was hoping you'd open the door first." Her voice was muffled by the scarf, but calm, steady. Warren studied her, his instincts still on high alert. "You alone?" She nodded. "I parked my truck a few miles back. Snow's too deep to drive through." That didn't answer the bigger question. What was she doing here? Before he could ask, her gaze flicked past him, to the wolves. Her entire posture changed, shoulders stiffening, breath hitching in the cold air. "They're here." Warren frowned. "You know these wolves." She stepped closer, still cautious, but there was something else in her movements now, urgency. "I've been tracking them for days," she said, eyes locked on the animals inside his cabin. "They belong to a monitored pack. We lost their signal after the last blizzard." Warren's grip on the door tightened. That explained a lot. "These two showed up last night," he admitted. "Half frozen, starving, one of them's injured." The woman exhaled, relief washing over her face. She reached up and pulled her scarf down, revealing tired but determined features. "I'm Kara," she said. "I work with the North Ridge Wildlife Center. These wolves, they weren't supposed to be alone." Warren glanced back at them. The larger wolf had risen to its feet now, standing protectively over the smaller. Its gaze flicked between him and Kara, unsure of this new presence. "They got separated?" Warren asked. Kara nodded. "Yes. They were part of a pack that's been under study for the last year. We track their movements, monitor their health. When the blizzard hit, their signals disappeared." She stepped closer, lowering her voice slightly. "We feared the worst." Warren's chest tightened. He looked back at the wolves again, suddenly seeing them in a different light. These weren't just random strays. They had a family out there, a pack, and they had lost it. He exhaled sharply. "So what happens now?" Kara glanced at the injured wolf, her brow furrowing. "We need to get them back to our center, especially the injured one. It won't survive much longer without treatment." Warren felt a strange pull in his chest. He had only known these wolves for a few hours, but the thought of them being taken away left an unexpected heaviness in his gut. He rubbed his jaw. "And if they heal?" Kara hesitated. "Then we release them, back where they belong." The larger wolf let out a low, cautious growl, sensing the shift in tension. Warren met its gaze, understanding the unspoken message in its eyes. It wouldn't leave its injured companion behind, and strangely enough, neither would he. The cabin felt smaller now. Warren stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Kara knelt beside the injured wolf, her experienced hands carefully assessing its leg. The animal whimpered but didn't fight her touch, too weak to resist. The larger wolf stood close, watching her every move with sharp, unblinking eyes. "She won't make it out here," Kara murmured, her voice edged with concern. "The leg is badly swollen. It could be an old injury made worse by the cold or even frostbite. If we don't get her proper medical attention soon, infection will set in." Warren exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of his neck. He had known this moment was coming. Letting the wolves inside last night had been a gut decision, one he hadn't had time to second-guess. But now in the daylight, with a stranger standing in his cabin telling him these animals belong somewhere else, it felt different. "I've been taking care of them," he said, his voice gruff. "They're doing better already." Kara sighed, standing up. I know, and I'm grateful for that. If you hadn't let them in, they probably wouldn't have survived the night. She gestured to the smaller wolf, still curled on the blanket near the fire. But look at her, Warren. She's in pain. She needs antibiotics, proper treatment. I can give her that. Warren knew she was right, but part of him resisted. These wolves had come to him, not to some rescue center. To him. He had spent the night watching over them, feeding them, earning their trust. They had made it through the worst part, and now, just when they were beginning to feel safe, he was supposed to let them go. He glanced at the larger wolf, still standing guard, muscles tight. He wasn't the only one struggling with this. What happens to them after? He asked, voice quieter now. Kara studied him for a moment, as if sensing the conflict inside him. Once they're healed, we'll try to reunite them with their pack. If the pack has moved on, we'll introduce them to a new one in a protected area. Warren frowned. And if that doesn't work? A hesitation, a beat too long before she answered. Then we find an alternative. But I promise, we don't just abandon them. He didn't like the way that sounded. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had seen too much of the world's cruelty to believe in easy promises. He had taken these wolves in because they had nowhere else to go. And now some wildlife organization was supposed to decide their future. They trust me, he said firmly. Kara nodded. I can see that. But trust isn't enough, Warren. Survival is. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. The fire crackled in the silence between them. Warren looked down at the injured wolf again. Her breathing was steady, but her body was weak. She didn't have much fight left. And he knew. Deep down, he knew this wasn't his fight. It didn't make it easier. He swallowed hard, exhaling, slowly. If I say yes, I go with you. Kara blinked, then nodded. Okay. The larger wolf let out a low, uncertain growl. Warren turned to him, holding his gaze. She's going to be okay, he murmured. I'll make sure of it. It wasn't a promise he was sure he could keep, but it was the only one he had to offer. The wind had begun to shift. Warren could feel it in the air, a bitter sharpness, a warning carried on the icy breeze. The Alaskan wilderness was unpredictable, and when the sky darkened like this, it meant one thing. A storm was coming. They didn't have much time. Inside the cabin, the injured wolf lay curled by the fire, her breaths slow but steady. The larger wolf remained close, watching Warren and Kara with cautious, unreadable eyes. They had agreed they would take the wolves to the wildlife center. It was the right decision, even if Warren didn't like it. But something kept pulling at his thoughts, an unease that wouldn't settle. When he had gone outside earlier to gather more firewood, he had noticed something strange. Tracks. Faint. Partially covered by fresh snowfall, leading away from his cabin into the dense forest. They weren't from the two wolves he had taken in. Another wolf had been here. Recently. Now, as he stood on his porch, scanning the white expanse beyond, the trees, the unease hardened into certainty. Something was out there. What is it? Kara asked, stepping up beside him. Warren didn't answer immediately. He lifted his rifle, not in defense, but to use the scope for a clearer view. He scanned the tree line, searching, looking for movement. Then he saw it. A flicker of gray, just beyond the trees. A shape hunched low in the snow. His stomach twisted. Another wolf. This one was alone, its body still, almost as if it had collapsed. Its head lifted weakly, ears flattened, but even from this distance Warren could see the signs. It was starving, injured, just like the others. A surge of instinct kicked in. He had to go. I need to check this out, he muttered, already grabbing his coat. Kara's hand caught his arm. Warren, wait, we don't have time, the storm's closing in. He pulled free. If there's another wolf out there, it won't survive the storm. We can't just leave it. Kara hesitated, but the conflict in her eyes was brief. She knew as well as he did. They couldn't ignore this. Warren moved fast, pulling his rifle strap over his shoulder and stepping into the snow, boots crunching in the frozen crust. The cold was biting, the wind picking up speed. Behind him, he heard Kara following. The tracks led into the forest, weaving between thick pines. The wolf hadn't gotten far, and then, suddenly, it was there. Collapsed against the base of a tree, sides rising and falling with labored effort. Its fur was patchy, its ribs stark against its thin frame. When it noticed them, it let out a weak, warning growl, defensive but too tired to fight. Warren lowered himself slowly, setting his rifle down. "Easy," he murmured, voice steady. "We're not here to hurt you." The wolf didn't move. It couldn't. Kara crouched beside him. "It's worse off than the others," she whispered. "If we don't get it back to the cabin now, it won't make it." Warren nodded, then made a decision, a risky one. Without hesitation, he took off his coat and carefully draped it over the wolf. The animal flinched, but didn't have the strength to resist. Moving quickly but gently, he scooped it up, cradling it against his chest. It was lighter than he expected. Too light. The wolf whimpered, but it didn't fight. Kara shot him a tense look. "Can you carry it?" "I don't have a choice." Warren gritted out, adjusting his grip. The wind roared around them as they hurried back toward the cabin, snow whipping against their faces. Warren's arms burned, but he didn't slow down. Not now. By the time they reached the porch, he could already hear the storm's full force moving in behind them. As he stepped inside, the two other wolves reacted immediately. The larger one rose to its feet, ears twitching, its gaze locking onto the wolf in Warren's arms. Then something shifted in its stance. Recognition. The injured wolf let out a weak whimper, and in that moment, Warren knew. They had found their missing packmate. The wind howled through the trees, a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. Snow whipped violently across the landscape, swirling in thick, blinding sheets. The storm had arrived faster than expected, cutting visibility down to almost nothing. Inside the cabin, Warren paced near the door, his jaw tight as he listened to the wind battering against the wooden walls. The warmth from the fire barely pushed back the creeping cold, seeping through the cracks. Kara stood near the window, gripping her radio. Static crackled through the speaker, but no voices came through. She cursed under her breath, adjusting the frequency. "Dan, do you copy?" She tried again, her voice tense. More static. "They should have been here by now," Warren muttered. "If the roads weren't already bad, this storm just made them impossible." Kara nodded, frustration flashing in her eyes. "We knew it was coming, but not this fast. If they're stuck somewhere, they might not get through until morning." That wasn't good enough. The wolves needed medical care, especially the injured one. Warren glanced at them. The three wolves huddled together near the fire, their bodies tense, their ears flicking at every gust of wind. The injured one barely lifted her head, but the larger wolf sat rigid, staring at the door as if it sensed something beyond the storm. Warren didn't like that. "They're restless," he noted. Kara followed his gaze. "Wolves can sense things we can't. The storm, the pressure drop, maybe more." Maybe more. A bad feeling settled in Warren's gut. He checked his supplies. They had enough wood to last the night, but if the storm raged on into the next day, they'd be cutting it close. Food was another issue. He had already given most of his remaining meat to the wolves. He could ration, but if they were stuck here longer than expected... A sharp thud hit the side of the cabin. Both he and Kara spun toward the sound. The larger wolf snapped to attention, a deep growl rumbling in its throat. Warren grabbed his rifle. That wasn't the wind. Kara reached for her flashlight. Could be a fallen branch. Warren wasn't convinced. The wolf's sudden alertness said otherwise. He moved to the door and pressed his ear against the wood. The storm screamed outside, but beneath it, something else. A sound too faint to identify. Another thud. The wolves tensed. The larger one stepped forward, standing protectively in front of the injured one. Kara exhaled. "We're not alone, are we?" Warren didn't answer. Slowly, carefully, he unlatched the door and cracked it open just enough to peer outside. Nothing. Just white. The storm was too thick to see more than a few feet in any direction. Snowflakes lashed against his face, ice-cold needles biting into his skin. Then, movement. A shadow shifting beyond the trees, too big to be the wind. His pulse kicked up. He pulled back and shut the door, bolting it. Something's out there. Kara's face paled. What kind of something? Warren didn't know, and that was the problem. They had come too far to lose now. But the night was just beginning. By dawn, the storm had passed. The once howling winds had settled into an eerie silence, leaving behind a world buried under a thick, undisturbed blanket of snow. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting a pale glow inside the cabin. Warren stood by the fireplace, rubbing his hands together for warmth, exhaustion pressing heavily on his shoulders. They had made it through the night. Behind him, Kara was already trying her radio again, turning the dial with tense fingers. Static crackled through the speaker, and then, finally, a voice broke through. "Kara, do you copy?" Relief flooded her face. "Dan, we're here. The storm trapped us overnight, but we're all safe." "Roads are clearing up," Dan replied. "We'll be there in 20 minutes. Hang tight." She turned to Warren, exhaling. "They're coming." Warren nodded, glancing at the wolves. The larger one was awake, ears pricked toward the door as if sensing the change in the air. The injured one remained curled near the fire, still weak, but breathing easier. The third wolf, the one Warren had carried through the snow, lay close to them, finally resting after its ordeal. And yet something about them had changed. When the third wolf had arrived, there had been tension, uncertainty in their movements, hesitancy in their eyes. But now, they were closer. The larger wolf had positioned itself protectively between the two others, its nose nudging them both from time to time, as if reassuring itself that they were still there. The injured wolf had started leaning against the new arrival, seeking comfort. Even in their weakened state, there was something instinctive and familiar in the way they moved around each other. A pack reunited. Warren swallowed past the lump in his throat. They had been looking for each other all along. A knock at the door broke the moment. Kara moved quickly, unbolting the lock. Cold air rushed in as two figures stepped inside, Dan and Nina, bundled in thick winter gear, their faces flushed from the cold. "Good to see you both in one piece," Dan said, stamping snow from his boots. "Let's get these wolves ready for transport." Nina moved toward the injured one first, crouching carefully. "She's in rough shape, but we'll take good care of her." The larger wolf growled low in its throat, stepping forward. Warren instinctively put a hand out, a calming gesture. "Easy," he murmured. "They're here to help." The wolf hesitated, but its growl faded. Its golden eyes flicked to Warren, then to Kara as if searching for confirmation. "They'll be safe," Kara reassured softly. The wolves didn't understand words, but they understood trust. With patience and care, the team worked quickly. They set up a large padded transport crate inside the truck, making sure it was warm enough for the journey. The injured wolf was lifted first, wrapped gently in blankets. The third wolf followed, though its tired body still trembled. The last to enter was the larger one. It hesitated at the door of the crate, glancing back once. At Warren. For a moment, man and wolf held each other's gaze. Then, with a quiet exhale, the wolf stepped inside, curling up beside the others. Warren let out a slow breath. It was time. Kara placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You saved them, Warren." He wasn't sure what to say. He just watched as the doors to the truck closed, carrying his wolves towards safety. The engine rumbled to life, breaking the stillness of the snow-covered morning. Warren stood beside Kara, arms crossed tightly over his chest, his breath forming faint clouds in the freezing air. The transport truck, now loaded with the three wolves, idled at the edge of his property, its exhaust curling into the crisp sky. Inside the padded crate, the wolves huddled together, their golden eyes peering out through the narrow gaps. The larger one, the protector, sat upright, still, watching, still aware. The injured one remained curled into the warmth of its packmates, its breathing steadier now. The third wolf, the last to be found, had pressed itself close to the others, finding comfort in their presence. They weren't alone anymore. Warren exhaled slowly. He had known this moment was coming, but he hadn't expected the tightness in his chest as he watched the truck prepare to leave. He had spent barely 2 nights with them, 2 nights of trust, of survival, of understanding, and yet somehow it felt like much longer. "They'll be okay," Kara said softly beside him, as if sensing the weight of his silence. Warren nodded once, his jaw tight. He knew they would. The wildlife center would care for them, heal them, and then, if everything went as planned, they would return to the wild. Back where they belonged. It was the right thing to do, he knew that. So why did it feel like he was losing something? The Feu. Truck's tires crunched over the snow as it started forward. The larger wolf shifted slightly, its gaze still locked onto Warren. He didn't know if wolves understood goodbyes, but there was something in its eyes, a recognition, an unspoken farewell. Then, just as the truck moved past the tree line, the wolf did something Warren didn't expect. It let out a single low howl, not loud, not desperate, just a sound that lingered in the cold air, curling through the trees like smoke. Warren swallowed hard. Then the truck disappeared into the forest, leaving behind only tire tracks and silence. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring, at the empty space where the wolves had been. Kara touched his arm lightly. "You can visit them, you know." He nodded, but his voice didn't come right away. When it finally did, it was quieter than he intended. "Yeah." She smiled knowingly, then turned toward her own vehicle. "Take care of yourself, Warren. You, too." With that, she climbed into her truck and drove off, leaving Warren alone in the clearing. The wind whispered through the trees, stirring the freshly fallen snow. Everything felt too quiet now, too still. He turned toward his cabin. The fire inside had burned down to embers. The blankets near the hearth were still ruffled from where the wolves had slept. Their scent lingered faintly in the air, a reminder that they had been here. That for a brief, extraordinary moment, he had shared his home with something wild. As he stoked the fire back to life, he thought about the thin line between man and nature. He had always believed that wolves were meant to stay on one side, and humans on the other. But last night, in the dead of winter, that line had blurred, and maybe, just maybe, it always had been.